Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are really glad to have you with us for this 2026 strategic reflection. Normally, Greg and I would use this conversation to look back over the past year and identify longer-term patterns. But this time, we felt that simple reflection wasn't enough. The capture of Venezuela's serving president inside the country by U.S. forces on January 3rd wasn't just another news headline. Let me start with a hard question. Washington is framing the Venezuela operation through a modernized reading of the Monroe Doctrine. Greg, from your perspective in the intelligence community, what does this apparent return to 19th century neighborhood rules actually mean for the global order today?
Well, I'm tempted to say, following that famous predictor of the future, Yogi Berra, the baseball player, that prediction is too hard, particularly about the future. And in this case, I think that's very much so. We really don't know where we're going. What we know is where we're not going. What's ended really is any vestige of what we call maybe too apt too quickly the liberal international order, sustained really by U.S. power and influence, but a liberal order. We know that that's gone, replaced by, as you suggest, a kind of a 19th century vision of sovereignty. Might call it precision sovereignty, saying that there's spheres of influence in which the strong will do what they want and the weak will do what they must. That is a very different world than the one we've known for the last 80 years. It's one that seems to me that is full of danger. We don't know how this is going to turn out. It may turn out that the attempt to run Venezuela is a great mistake, and we regret it and return to somewhat more normalcy, but that doesn't seem likely. What does seem likely is that this is going to suggest a kind of 19th century spheres of influence model, transactional and mercantile, and a kind of an invitation. I don't think China's going to do anything rash at the moment, but this is a sort of invitation to strong powers to do what they want in their respective regions. It's certainly got to be music to Vladimir Putin's ears, so it justifies what he did in Ukraine. So we are entering, it seems to me, a very different world. We'd be a fool to predict its precise shape, but we know what it won't be, even if we're not quite sure what it will be. I'd be interested in your view, Pari. How does this look through a technological lens?
The first thing I would like to emphasize is we should stop thinking about the internet as a flat network. It's actually a vertical architecture. So sovereignty today isn't about borders anymore. It's about which of the 6 layers of the global tech stack you actually control. So let me briefly explain these layers. Layer 1 is physical, the energy grids, subsea cables, and satellites. If you don't secure your energy, you can't secure your state, basically. And let's remember Venezuela is an oil-rich country. Second layer is the compute, the high-end chips and GPU. This is the new heavy industry. The layer 3 is cloud and services, the platforms and payment rails like Starlink and Swift. So these are the de facto geopolitical infrastructure. Then we have layer 4, which is data, the vast repositories of intelligence and identity, the fuel for modern enforcement. Layer 5 is AI, the algorithmic brain that compresses decision-making into milliseconds. And then we have layer 6, which is governance, the fragile layer of laws and its international architecture and multi-stakeholder dialogue. So in Venezuela, the US already has occupied layer 3 and 4. They didn't need to invade and have boots on the ground because they already own the service and data. So these choke points, the intelligence was there, and already through the services and sanctions, they choked the country. But Venezuela is just one illustration of the broader pattern. Greg, if we zoom out and look at the wider geopolitical map, How does this logic of precision sovereignty reshapes the way we understand other contexts, such as conflict in Ukraine or the evolving tensions in the Middle East?
In Ukraine, we see a game of kind of endurance. The question is, how long can Russia continue this grinding war before Ukraine has to say uncle and agree to something that it doesn't want? Again, we don't know. The wild card in all that is Mr. Trump yet again. Is he going to put pressure on Zelensky and the Ukrainians to do something? Or are they going to find that they lose the endurance race? Or will Russia? My own sense is this has got to turn out badly for Russia, but it will turn out very badly for Ukraine in any case as well. So we're seeing there that strong do what they will, weak do what they must in play. The Middle East, I think, is more complicated there. There's lots of issues in play, but plainly, Israel is now by far the dominant power and will do, as we've seen, what it wants to do in Lebanon, in Syria, and maybe even Iran. That's obviously a great worry. So there we see, again, a kind of muscular definition of precision, localized sovereignty. And I think unfortunately, that's the immediate future. What the mercantile dimension adds is sort of unpredictable. We know that part of Trump's interest in Venezuela is oil. That's pretty far-fetched in some sense because it's going to take an awful long time and a lot of money to resurrect the Venezuelan oil industry. It's also very heavy oil, so that makes it difficult to refine and difficult to deal with. So the idea of immediate riches and oil companies flocking to Venezuela to rebuild the oil industry, that's a fantasy, but it's a fantasy that Mr. Trump seems eager to play out. Whether other countries will follow that mercantile dimension is not clear to me. In some sense, rather than China coming to emulate us as we'd rather hoped 20 years ago, we're now looking a lot more like them, with even a Republican administration engaging in very much of an industrial policy. One of the big geopolitical issues that doesn't get enough attention is electricity. We're entering a world in which electricity is a very big geopolitical factor. And that's one where China is doing particularly well. They've installed more electric capacity. What they installed in the last year is about a third of the total capacity of the United States. So they are making huge strides and will win if you think of this as kind of an electrical stack on which AI and lots of other things depend. They're very well positioned. So even if the United States is in some sense ahead in the race for the most sophisticated artificial intelligence, China is well ahead in this energy stack on which so much depends in this future geopolitical world. Let me ask you, what about, we've seen the tensions between the original vision of the internet, which was bottom up, private sector driven on the one hand, and the temptations by countries to exercise sovereignty, again, over the internet. Where does that competition or competing visions stand as you look ahead?
As the world becomes more fragmented geopolitically, inevitably it's also manifests itself on internet. And the worrisome is that it becomes a splinternet, a total collapse. But I think right now we see many different scenarios playing out. First of all, I think the China and Russia case, they realize that being dependent on a Western stack is a kind of death sentence for them. So they have developed their own alternative system, parallel stack. So China has secured layer 1, energy, which you mentioned, and layer 2, compute, to build a closed loop. Russia provides the raw energy and battlefield data, because we shouldn't forget that Russia has been now for a number of years involved in a battlefield, while China provides the sovereign chips. So they're making themselves logically immune to the kill switch of Western cloud. So we may see a fragmentation of internet to two different parallel stacks. Ukraine is a very interesting case because it serves as a test case whether a smaller nation can maintain sovereignty by tethering itself to a larger power's infrastructure. And that's, I think, going to be a lesson learned by a lot of mid or smaller countries around the world. In terms of the Middle East, also, I want to add, in the 21st century, winning the kinetic battle on the ground matters less than the battle for narratives and perceptions. And I think we see in Middle East, while the ground battle is won, but the battle of narratives actually is lost in many ways. So it's important to realize that that kind of visibility also matters. Another point I like to make is on layer 4, data, and layer 5 AI. We have moved into agentic AI, systems that don't just produce content, but take action. So they coordinate drone swarms in Ukraine and manage surveillance in Iran. This is software-defined world. The danger is that it could compass decision-making so much that human judgment being squeezed out of it. So these are the areas that I think we need to be concerned about. But I'd like now to ask you, do you see that in future we are ending up in 2 or 3 technological empires?
I think so. I thought before recent events that the world was dividing into two loose clubs, one around China, one around the United States. And they weren't going to be clubs like the Cold War alliances. They were going to be much more fluid and open with a fair amount of fence sitting and moving back and forth. We've seen that with Europe alternately afraid of China, but also eager to have its investments and its commerce. So that was my imagining before recent events. And I think recent events have sort of put a punctuation point on that. It's still going to be basically, it seems to me, two clubs of sorts with one spoiler, the spoiler being Russia, which isn't able to attract many people or countries, but can spoil. We've seen the kind of campaign they're mounting in Europe, which really does run the risk of a shooting war. So far, it's been mostly in the virtual realm, but they've done incursions with drones and even fighter planes. So their possibility of being a spoiler, I think, is very great. But in general, it does seem there'll be sort of two technological domains or clubs, and countries will, I think countries in the South will probably continue to have quite a lot of flexibility to move back and forth to try and take the most of the US club or the China club. Now, there'll be some that may be subject to the precision sovereignty problem and taken over or at least coerced pretty openly. But I think the world is moving into that kind of two technological domains, and exactly what role the private sector plays. The private sector is obviously going to dominate those technological domains, at least in the US club. The Chinese club will be organized somewhat differently with SOEs and state-owned enterprises and other things, not just private companies, but we'll have an interesting test of which of those clubs looks more attractive to countries in the South. But I think that is the dimension. We see the two big technological changes that are a threat. One is in the nature of warfare, and they're the drones. You mentioned drones, and drones have been around for a very long time, but now have gotten cheap, and that means that countries that are relatively poor can employ them. The Ukrainians had a great advantage at the beginning of the war, which they've now mostly lost, but seeing the drone warfare. And the other is in the cyber realm, the kinds of things that disinformation campaigns and other things that Russia has mounted in Europe, really increasingly sophisticated, even as Russia moves into pretty difficult economic terrain. So those two technological changes will, I think, be important drivers of this geopolitical competition.
And what role the international organization that are formed for facilitating communication and diplomacy, how do you see those playing out?
We know that in this world of muscular sovereignty, the international organizations are not going to have anywhere near the role we'd hoped for them 80 years ago. They never have. The UN, for instance, has never been very effective at dealing with conflict, preventing conflict. That will continue to be the case. But we will need, I think, in this world, some forms of communication. And so some international bodies will be, I think, continue to be important. We know that while China didn't necessarily like the international order it entered in the early 21st century, it does need some order. It needs some communication, some international organization if it's going to achieve the prosperity it seeks. So the order, as we imagine it, isn't going to look like the one we'd hoped we had just after World War II, but there is going to be some need for some kind of forms of communication. So I think that the communication role of international institutions will become more important, even if their substantive role as actors is less.
As you know, I'm closely engaged with international governance institutions for internet, such as UN and ICANN. In December 2025, we had the Visas Plus 20 summit taking place in New York. And during that, IGF became permanent. And this was really a moment of celebration for the proponents of multi-stakeholder approach in global governance. However, with multilateral system in tatters, there are concerns about multi-stakeholder model, but I think there's also its necessity becomes more relevant. I think we are reaching a moment of truth for the international community. Purely state-to-state diplomacy is clearly failing because states no longer have total control over the tools of power, over their infrastructure, over their sovereignty. So much of that power is now in the hands of corporate sovereigns. So the companies that own the cables, the clouds, and AI models. So in this system, do you see any hope for multi-stakeholderism?
I do see some. In a sense, we're entering a very paradoxical world where nations are attempting to exercise sovereignty in very muscular ways at the same time as their relative power relative to the private sectors, both for-profit and non-for-profit, but particularly for-profit, is diminishing. So finding a way to incorporate these increasingly powerful private sector organizations in some kind of deliberation. We're a long way from guardrails or rulemaking about AI, but we have a stake in that. And finding ways to, even in this world of muscular sovereignty, to begin to communicate on those issues. And I think long overdue for the United States and China to have a serious conversation about AI. Because they both share an interest in not having the worst outcomes we can possibly imagine. And in some sense, they've taken quite different approaches to AI, where the US has said that companies let her rip, go as fast as you can. The Chinese have taken a somewhat more careful, kind of piece by piece view. And we might actually learn something from each other. But I fear that kind of collaboration isn't going to happen, but at least some cooperation we've had in the past, some agreements between the United States and China about cyber, limited agreements that lapsed in the late 2010s. But that communication, I think, is going to become all the more important as the world descends or changes into this one of rather muscular sovereignty.
So maybe IGF could act as a trusted corridor. Higher layers seems inevitably going to fragment. We could ensure that the basis of internet remains intact. So at least some degree of communication continues, not only between governments and private sector, but also between citizens around the world. So we don't end up in complete splintered net. Big lesson is geopolitics has gone vertical. And maybe we can keep the conversation horizontal in this vertical situation. And I think that's the mission that Global TechnoPolitics Forum is taking on for 2026.
Well, it sounds good. I think the real challenge in this world of muscular sovereignty, emphasis on sovereignty, emphasis on state power, will be to at least have some ways of discussing the interests we share. And we continue to share an interest in having a relatively open internet. We know it's going to have friction and be closed in some ways, but we share that interest, just as we share, despite everything, an interest in making sure that climate change doesn't destroy the human race. So I think the challenge for folks like us and the Global TechnoPolitics Forum will be to try and keep those conversations alive in geopolitical circumstances that aren't very favorable to them. I think that makes our role of trying to have that conversation about the intersection of geopolitics and technology all the more important, because it's going to be both necessary but more and more difficult in this changing geopolitical climate.
And on that note, I want to thank you and thank you everyone who joined us today. And that's the mission for 2026. Thank you.